What if I told you that Britain's first true rock idol, the man once hailed as the British Elvis, almost gave it all up before his career had even begun? Cliff Richard wasn't just another pop star in a sharp suit. He was a cultural explosion, a teenage dream, and a national obsession. But just when the spotlight was brightest, he did something no one could have predicted. Standing before thousands with cameras rolling and critics watching, he turned his back on the reckless rebellion of rock and roll and declared himself a man of faith. Overnight, the golden boy of British pop risked throwing away everything, his fame, his fortune, his future, for something far greater. The question is, why would the most adored teenager in the country gamble his career on faith? And how did that bold decision change not only his life, but the very shape of British pop music? For a generation growing up in the gray years of post-war Britain, music was more than entertainment. It was an escape. The country was rebuilding, rationing still lingered in memory, and young people were desperate for something that felt alive, dangerous, and new. Across the Atlantic, Elvis Presley had already set the world on fire, shaking his hips and electrifying teenagers with a sound their parents didn't understand. But Britain had no answer to Elvis. At least not yet. That all changed in 1958. A shy teenager from Hertfordshire named Harry Webb stepped into a recording studio with his backing group, The Drifters, and cut a track called Move It. From the first raw guitar riff, it was clear this wasn't just another polite pop song. It had bite, swagger, and an edge that Britain had never heard before. When Move It hit the airwaves, the reaction was immediate. Teenagers screamed, fainted, and rushed the stage in scenes straight out of American rock and roll films. Overnight, Harry Webb was gone. In his place stood Cliff Richard, a name chosen to echo the strength of a cliff and the raw power of Little Richard, one of his heroes. The press hailed him as the British Elvis. His slick quiff, his sharp suits, his smooth smile, Cliff embodied everything young people wanted. He wasn't just singing songs, he was leading a movement. For the first time, Britain had a rock idol of its own. By his late teens, Cliff was selling out concert halls, appearing on television, and sparking mass hysteria wherever he went. Fans clutched at his clothes, wrote his name in notebooks, and plastered their bedroom walls with his photos. His debut performances caused such a frenzy that newspapers compared him directly to Elvis, warning parents that their children were falling under his spell. But Cliff's appeal went beyond just his music. He had a charm that seemed untouchable, a smile that radiated innocence even as he sang songs that carried a rebellious edge. While Elvis scandalized American adults, Cliff walked a careful line, giving British youth just enough rebellion without terrifying the establishment. To many, he was the perfect star, clean, wholesome, but still thrilling. And as the hits rolled in, Living Doll, Travelin' Light, The Young Ones, Cliff Richard cemented himself as the golden boy of British pop. He wasn't just topping charts, he was defining an era. His image was everywhere, his voice blaring from radios, his concerts erupting in chaos. For a country long overshadowed by American imports, Cliff was proof that Britain could create its own superstar. He seemed unstoppable. The smiling face on every magazine cover. The boy next door who could sell 1 million records with a single song. The untouchable idol who brought joy to millions. But looks can be deceiving. Because while the world saw Cliff Richard as the perfect pop prince, adored and untouchable, his story was far more complicated. Behind the spotlight, there was a storm brewing. By the early 1960s, Cliff Richard wasn't just a star, he was a phenomenon. His records topped charts, his films filled cinemas, and his tours drew hysteria that Britain had never seen before. Parents might have been wary of rock and roll, but even they admitted that Cliff was different. He was safe, respectable, almost too good to be true. And yet, at the height of this frenzy, Cliff Richard did something that stunned the nation. He stood before thousands at a massive rally led by American evangelist Billy Graham and declared himself a Christian. This wasn't whispered in private. It wasn't a quiet change of heart. It was public, broadcast across the country for fans and critics alike to hear. The man billed as Britain's Elvis, the symbol of teenage rebellion, had just pledged himself to a life of faith. The reaction was instant. Record executives panicked. Behind closed doors, agents muttered that his career was finished. Pop idols were supposed to embody freedom, desire, rebellion, not piety. To executives, it was as if Cliff had torn up the rulebook of stardom in front of them. Would teenagers still scream for a singer who now preached about God? Would the media laugh him out of the spotlight? Even Cliff himself wasn't sure. He confessed that he felt torn between two lives, his faith and his music. One seemed to cancel out the other. Could he really sing songs about romance and heartbreak while dedicating himself to something far greater? At times, he considered walking away from it all. The thought of leaving the stage behind, disappearing into an ordinary life, even becoming a school teacher, crossed his mind more than once. It was a choice, Cliff later admitted, that nearly ended my career before it even began. For months, he wrestled with the decision. On one side was fame, fortune, and a career that had barely started but already promised to last a lifetime. On the other side was faith, something that demanded honesty, discipline, and sacrifice. But Cliff did something no one expected. He refused to choose. Instead of abandoning music, he fused the two, becoming the first major British pop star to openly live by his beliefs while still competing in the charts. And in a twist that silenced his critics, his career didn't collapse. Songs like The Young Ones and Summer Holiday continued to dominate, and Cliff's popularity only grew. But more importantly, Cliff himself changed. He later admitted that much of his early swagger had been an act, a mask to hide his insecurities. After embracing faith, that mask fell away. For the first time, he felt free to be himself. But with freedom came cost. Relationships faltered, personal sacrifices mounted, and the pressure of being both a star and a man of faith grew heavier with time. Cliff Richard had chosen a path no one believed possible. He would remain a pop idol, but one forever defined by the courage to live by his convictions. And while the world applauded his choice, privately, it set in motion struggles that would haunt him for decades. It was a choice that nearly ended his career before it even began, because when you walk the line between faith and fame, every step feels like a battle. In the 1970s, Cliff Richard was at the height of his fame. His face on magazine covers, his songs topping charts, and his concerts still sparking hysteria. To the world, he was the ever-smiling pop sensation. But behind that polished charm, Cliff carried a secret far more personal than any headline could capture. He had fallen deeply in love with one of the brightest rising stars of that era, Olivia Newton-John. From the moment they met, Cliff was captivated. Olivia had that rare blend of innocence and radiance, a presence that could light up a room without trying. She was warm, kind, and shared a musical spirit that matched his own. For Cliff, it wasn't just admiration. It was something deeper, something that grew quietly but powerfully. But there was a problem. Olivia's heart was already being drawn elsewhere, toward Bruce Welch, Cliff's close friend, guitarist from the Shadows, and a man Cliff respected greatly. It was an impossible situation. The woman he adored was falling in love with someone within his own circle, and Cliff had no choice but to stand on the sidelines. Imagine it, watching the one person who makes your heart race slip into someone else's arms and knowing that you could never say a word. Cliff once admitted years later that he had genuine hopes Olivia might be the one. He thought about marriage, about a life together. But Olivia never knew the depth of his feelings at the time. To her, Cliff was a close friend, a confidant, perhaps even a brother figure, but never the man she imagined spending her life with. And so he did what few could bear. He stayed silent. Out of loyalty, out of friendship, and perhaps out of fear, he buried his feelings. While Olivia and Bruce's relationship bloomed in public, Cliff suffered in silence. Each smile he showed to the cameras masking a heartbreak no one could see. That silent sacrifice became one of the most poignant chapters of Cliff's life. He later described it as one of the hardest things he had ever endured. Not because of bitterness, but because of the depth of love he felt and the choice he made not to interfere. His restraint was a mark of his character, but it came at a cost. For decades, that unspoken love lingered like a shadow. Even after Olivia's marriage, even after Cliff's own relationships came and went, the memory of what could have been followed him. It wasn't a scandal, it wasn't a betrayal, it was something far more human. The story of a man who chose loyalty over desire, silence over confession, and watched the love of his life slip away. Cliff once summed it up simply, "I loved her, but it wasn't meant to be." And in those few words, you can still hear the heartbreak of a man who carried the weight of love unspoken. A wound that fame, fortune, and applause could never heal. But this wouldn't be the only time Cliff Richard's private life clashed with his public image. Ahead lay choices, accusations, and a storm that would nearly consume him. By the early 1970s, the golden glow around Cliff Richard began to fade. The boy who had once been crowned the UK's answer to Elvis suddenly found himself facing an audience that was changing and leaving him behind. The rock and roll revolution he helped ignite was evolving, and the music press, once fascinated with him, now dismissed him as yesterday's star. To the outside world, Cliff's career looked like it was collapsing. His records stopped climbing the charts. The hysteria that had followed him everywhere seemed to vanish overnight. It was a brutal awakening. For someone who had dominated the stage for over a decade, irrelevance was the cruelest punishment. But Cliff Richard was not a man who accepted defeat. Instead of clinging to what once worked, he made a bold choice to reinvent himself. And in 1976, that reinvention arrived in the form of one song, Devil Woman. It was nothing like the Cliff Richard the public thought they knew. Darker, edgier, with a rock bite that demanded attention. The song roared onto the charts, breaking into the US top 10 and giving Cliff something he hadn't had for years, credibility. Suddenly, the man who had been written off as a relic was being talked about as relevant, as daring, as someone who could still surprise the world. But Cliff wasn't done. His ability to adapt, to bend without breaking, became his greatest strength. In the 1980s, when most artists of his era faded quietly into nostalgia, Cliff staged yet another comeback, this time with Mistletoe and Wine, a song that captured the holiday spirit and reignited his place as a household name. It wasn't just a hit, it became a seasonal classic, cementing Cliff as part of Britain's cultural fabric. And then came the milestone that silenced even his harshest critics, his record-breaking 100th single to reach the charts. Few artists in history had ever achieved such a feat. It wasn't just about sales, it was about resilience. Cliff Richard had proven that he was no passing fad, no teen idol who faded with the decade. He was something far rarer. An artist who could survive collapse, reinvent himself, and rise again, stronger each time. The press had once predicted his end. Radio stations had once stopped playing his songs. Yet here he was, not just surviving, but thriving.
Cliff Richard refused to fade. He refused to become a footnote in pop history. Instead, he rewrote the rules. He reminded the world that reinvention is not weakness, it is power. And in doing so, Cliff carved out something far greater than fleeting fame. He built a legacy that would endure across generations. But just as Cliff had mastered the art of survival in the music world, a storm was waiting on the horizon, one that would threaten not just his career, but his very reputation. By the late 1990s, Cliff had weathered storms that would have ended most careers. He had endured decline, reinvented himself, and reached historic milestones. But as the new millennium approached, Cliff prepared a song that would expose just how deeply the music industry had turned against him. It was called the Millennium Prayer. A bold, unconventional track set to the melody of Auld Lang Syne, with lyrics lifted directly from the Lord's Prayer. To Cliff, it was a message of hope for the world as it stepped into the year 2000, a spiritual anthem meant to unify people at a turning point in history. But the industry did not see it that way. Radio stations scoffed, executives shook their heads. Even his own label dismissed it, refusing to back the song. They called it old-fashioned, embarrassing, out of touch. One station even joked on air that Cliff's music belonged in the attic, not on the airwaves. For a man who had been Britain's most consistent hitmaker, it was a brutal slap in the face. And yet, Cliff's fans were not about to let him fall. The moment the Millennium Prayer was released independently, his supporters rallied with passion. They organized campaigns, bought multiple copies, and demanded it be heard. In an age before social media, this was grassroots dedication at its purest. The music industry had rejected him, but the people, the ones who had grown up with him, believed in him, and loved him, lifted him higher than anyone expected.
Against all odds, the Millennium Prayer shot to #1 on the UK charts. Cliff Richard had once again defied every prediction, every insult, every dismissal. It was his 14th chart topper, spanning an incredible 5 decades of #1 hits. No artist in Britain had matched such a record. But victory came with a bitter aftertaste. While the fans celebrated, much of the media mocked the success, calling it a novelty hit, refusing to give Cliff the respect his achievement deserved. The industry that had once crowned him his golden boy now treated him like an outsider, a relic kept alive only by loyal followers. Cliff himself acknowledged the sting, later saying, "They just didn't want me there anymore. It didn't matter how many records I sold, they had decided I was finished." And yet he wasn't finished, far from it. Because what the Millennium Prayer truly proved was that Cliff Richard no longer needed the industry to validate him. His connection with his fans, the people who had carried him since the days of Move It, was stronger than any radio playlist, stronger than any critic's sneer. He had been betrayed by the industry, yes, mocked, rejected, written off. But he had also been vindicated. For in that moment, Cliff Richard reminded the world of a truth the music business never wanted to admit. Sometimes, the audience knows better than the gatekeepers. It was August 2014 when Cliff Richard's world came crashing down. At 73 years old, the man once celebrated as Britain's eternal pop idol suddenly found himself at the center of a storm unlike any he had ever known. On a quiet summer morning, while Cliff was away, police descended on his Berkshire apartment. But this was no ordinary investigation. Cameras were already in place. The BBC had been tipped off, granted advance notice of the raid. What followed was a surreal, almost cinematic broadcast. Helicopters circling, reporters narrating every movement, cameras zooming in on police officers entering his home. For millions watching at home, the images were shocking. Cliff Richard, Sir Cliff Richard, was being linked to allegations of historical sexual abuse. No charges, no arrest,
Not even an interview. Just images, headlines, and a tidal wave of insinuation. The impact was immediate and brutal. Across newspapers, Cliff's name was splashed alongside words like investigation and abuse. For decades, he had been the clean-cut star, the smiling face of British pop. Now, in the matter of hours, his reputation was torn apart in front of the entire world. Behind the cameras, Cliff was shattered. Friends later described how he barely slept, plagued with insomnia as the headlines spiraled out of control. He lost weight. His once bright demeanor dimmed. Even when he walked into a room of friends, he felt the invisible shadow of suspicion. And yet there was nothing, no evidence, no testimony strong enough to stand. After nearly 2 years of torment, the case collapsed. Prosecutors confirmed what Cliff had known all along. He was innocent. No charges would ever be filed. But the damage had already been done. For Cliff, the humiliation cut deeper than words. He later described the ordeal as the worst thing that's ever happened to me in my life. To be publicly branded, judged before trial, and exposed to the world in such a way, it was a betrayal not just by the police, but by the very media that had once celebrated him. The BBC would later apologize, and Cliff eventually won damages in a landmark privacy case. But even with victory in court, the scars remained. He admitted that trust, both in the system and in people, was forever shaken. And then came the hardest question of all. Even after being cleared, would people ever see him the same way again? For Cliff Richard, the raid was not just about allegations. It was about identity, legacy, and survival. He had faced career decline, heartbreak, and industry betrayal before. But this was different. This was a stain he could not simply erase. Even after being cleared, the question lingered. Would people ever see him the same way again? When the dust settled after the raid, Cliff Richard was not the same man the public had once known. The smiling face, the polished charm, the performer who had filled stadiums. Behind it all was someone broken by betrayal. The toll was immense. Years of suspicion, of cameras circling his name like vultures, left wounds that fame could not heal. Cliff admitted he was plagued with insomnia, that he had lost weight, that the anxiety never truly went away. Even after being cleared of all allegations, the headlines had left a stain that felt permanent. It was as though, in the court of public opinion, innocence was not enough.
For decades, Cliff had been a symbol of resilience. He had survived industry rejection, heartbreak, and shifting musical tides. But this was different. This wasn't about records or reviews. It was about dignity. And so, Cliff Richard made a decision that stunned many. He withdrew. He pulled back from the constant glare of the spotlight. No more front-page interviews. No more chasing radio play. Instead, he retreated quietly abroad, spending more time at his home in Portugal, where the sun and sea offered a refuge far from the chaos of London tabloids. In those quiet moments, he found something the stage could never give him: peace. And yet, his absence left questions. Why would a man who sold over 250 million records worldwide, who achieved chart-topping hits across 6 decades, who was knighted for his contributions to music and charity, simply step away? The answer lies not in failure, but in survival. Cliff Richard's story is not just one of fame, it is one of faith, endurance, and resilience in the face of storms that would have destroyed most. To some, his withdrawal was a tragedy. They saw a legend silenced, a voice missing from the stage. To others, it was justice, an artist finally claiming the quiet he had earned after decades of giving himself to the world. But beneath the debates lies the haunting truth. Cliff Richard didn't vanish because he lost relevance. He vanished because he had been wounded by the very world he once entertained. Fame gave him everything, but it also took everything away. And so, as the curtain falls on his story, we are left with one final question. Did Cliff Richard deserve the silence he chose, or did the world drive him into it? And so we come to the end of Cliff Richard's journey, a story filled with dazzling highs, heartbreaking lows, and twists that no scriptwriter could imagine. From the teenage hysteria of Move It to the haunting silence after the raid, Cliff's life has been more than just the tale of a pop star. It has been the story of survival, of faith, of resilience, of a man who gave the world decades of music only to face betrayal from the very institutions that once celebrated him. But here's the question that lingers long after the music fades. Was Cliff Richard treated unfairly by the industry and media? Think about it. When he declared his faith, the industry mocked him. When he reinvented himself, they dismissed him. When his fans carried him to #1, the press sneered. And when he faced allegations that collapsed under scrutiny, his name was dragged through the mud for the world to see. Yes, he triumphed. Yes, he survived. But at what cost? This is where I want to hear from you. Do you believe Cliff Richard was treated unfairly by the industry and media? Or do you think this was simply the price of fame, a cost every legend must eventually pay? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters here. This isn't just about Cliff. It's about how we treat our icons, how easily we build them up, and how quickly we tear them down. And if you've been moved by this story, if you believe that the truth behind the music deserves to be told, then don't let this be the end of the conversation. Hit that like button so more people can discover this video, and click subscribe so you never miss the hidden stories behind the legends you thought you knew.